Let us pray. Father, God of mercy and love, we thank you for your gift to us of the Reverend F. Washington Jarvis, and we thank you for Tony's unfailing and generous gift of himself, his gift of himself to you and to all of us. We are grateful that Tony never stopped giving himself to you, Father, and to us. We are grateful that Tony was faithful and true. We thank you, Father, for the many ways Tony influenced, much for the better, the lives of so many boys here at Roxbury Latin School, and how he influenced the lives of so many Roxbury Latin parents and their families with his kindness, his understanding of the human condition, and his compassion. We thank you, Father, for Tony's vision and for his perseverance, for making us laugh when he may have been wrong or seemed to be wrong. We thank you, Father, for Tony's example of courage and patience during his lengthy and often painful illness. We thank you, Father, for Tony's unshakable faith in your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom Tony knew that he would receive the gifts of unending peace and eternal life and happiness in heaven in your presence, which Tony is enjoying now as we gather here and remember him today at Roxbury Latin School, which he loved so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Please be seated. If there's any doubts about whether Tony is still pulling the strings or not, imagine how delighted he would be in this London day of ours. Welcome, friends, to the oldest school in continuous existence in North America. He didn't just say it, it happens to be true. And this special convocation. Today we all gather to remember and honor the Reverend F. Washington Jarvis, Roxbury Latin's 10th headmaster, who for 30 action-packed years led and shaped our community. Tony arrived at Roxbury Latin in 1974 at a critical time in its long history. And shortly, and ever after, he would eloquently and persistently remind all of us of the opportunity we had to realize a school that offered to boys a reminder of their unique gifts and their responsibility for living lives of consequence and meaning. Those of us fortunate enough to work with and for Tony could not have had a better teacher, as he modeled for us the transformational impulse of a dedicated schoolmaster. So too did he take seriously his other compelling calling, for he sought not simply to save lives, but when all was said and done, to save souls. Tony was caring, demanding, multi-talented, generous, unreasonable, perfectionistic, loyal, hardworking, and eccentric. He was a man of few gray areas. He knew what he believed in, what he hoped to achieve, and how to get there. There appeared to be little ambiguity or ambivalence about Tony Jarvis. But alas, some of us were also allowed to see his vulnerability, and indeed his humility. When all was said and done, he took none of it for granted, and realized and was grateful for the opportunity to affect positively generations of largely unsuspecting, but ultimately positively affected students. He taught us that knowing and loving boys was our principal task, and he modeled that for us. Today you will hear from friends, students, and colleagues who knew Tony in his various capacities and at various times during his life. Imagine what Tony would do at this moment. These various friends, students, and colleagues of Tony will add dimension and color to what I have said and what has been said and written about Tony since his passing in early October. For their good thoughts and willingness to share with us today, I am especially grateful, as I am for the witness of all of you in our company on this occasion. Please stand. Dominus vobiscum, oremus, Pater noster, qui es in caelis, sanctificator nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in caelo et in terra, panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo, nam tuum est regnum et potentia et gloria in saecula. Amen. Please be seated.
Please bow your heads with me one more time, if you would. Do not pray for easy lives. Pray to be stronger men. Do not pray for tasks equal to your powers. Pray for powers equal to your tasks. Then the doing of your work shall be no miracle, but you shall be the miracle. Good afternoon. Oh, I know you can do better than that. Good afternoon. It's good to be with you here in Hall today, and thank you for singing so enthusiastically the Commemoration Hymn. Do the same, won't you, with Jerusalem and with the Founder's Song, surely the only school song in creation that references not just the Cavaliers, but also the Roundheads. Imagine leaving out the Roundheads. Now, there is no better tribute to the man most of you know as Father Jarvis, the man whom we knew as Uncle Tony, or more often simply as UT, than to sing as if you mean it, hymns in particular. Hymns are, after all, the perfect expression of community, the embodiment of faith in song. And UT had faith, and we have community. Now, I am Ned Smith, UT's oldest nephew, and with me today are my younger brother and sister, their wife and husband, Ben and Cricket, Stacy and Brett, and my father, Craig. And on behalf of all of us, thank you for having us today. My mother, Faith, was Tony's only sibling, and she died in 2012. And UT would surely tell us that he has ascended to the kingdom, as he regularly put it when describing a strong performance of a piece of music, or a spirited conversation, or just about any dessert. It didn't matter if you had just served him an Oreo after Mickey D's, or if he had just finished a tasting at L'Espalier. I have died and gone to heaven, he'd say. And he has now actually ascended to heaven to be with my mom and their parents, Granny and Grandpapa. We used to laugh when recounting phone calls with Uncle Tony. Sometimes it was the way in which he launched right in. Never a hello, never is this a good time. It was always, Edward, it's UT. I need to speak with you. And my suspicion is that many of you here today recognize that approach. Dispensing with the formalities without any salutation whatsoever, he'd get right down to business. Doesn't matter that you were in the middle of preparing dinner or brushing your teeth or saying your prayers. He wanted to get after it right then and there. And after it, you'd get. And the nicknames, always the nicknames. Mom was Dee Dee, Dad was Craigie, I was Edward, Ben was Jam, Cricket was Crickery, Tony's nieces and nephews were, respectively, Katadiah, Annifer, Moth, Sarah, as in que sera, sera, and big T, respectively. This was his way of connecting with each of us, of making each relationship unique to him, of making each of us feel special. UT called several years ago, asking me to look up little Jebby, one of his boys, an RL graduate, now resident as I am of Houston, Texas. Inevitably, of course, Jeb Liggums turned out to be anything but little, neither petite nor reserved. In fact, Jeb could have starred next to James Dean in Giant, complete with a 10-gallon hat and a private plane. But Jeb was, and it won't surprise you to hear this, looking for the RL of Houston for his own boys, and he was having trouble finding it. The reason, of course, is that there is only one RL, just as there is only one Father Jarvis. Jeb eventually chose a school whose headmaster regularly quotes UT by name as the greatest educator of his generation. And take my words for it, this is no small thing coming from a Texan. In my 30 years in independent schools like this one, there's no higher praise for a school than as a place where students are known and loved, just as UT knew and loved each and every one of you, his RL boys. Now, there was one feature of UT's phone calls worth recollecting. Regardless of the purpose or the timing or the duration of the conversation, his calls to us in the family always wound up with a dial tone as valediction. He would just hang up when he was done. Click. There was never a goodbye or a see you next week or love you, just the click. WTH. Did he do that with others outside the family too? Edward, I have to talk to you right away about one of my boys, little Jebby. I have died and gone to heaven. Click. That's how I'll remember UT. He made the most of every moment, dispensing with the pleasantries to get to the business at hand. The difficult but rewarding work of doing good in the world, the work that when complete inspires the deepest satisfaction, the work that inspired Phillips Brooks, another famous Boston priest and schoolmaster, to prayers like the one with which I began today. You see, UT continues to do good work in the world through each of you and through each of us and through the relationships we shared with him, conjured in an instant, regardless of the barrier of time or the obstacle of place, in the use of a nickname. And as to that last click, UT didn't like to say goodbye. He didn't like to acknowledge the end. And of course, as we are demonstrating here today, he didn't have to acknowledge the end. As a priest in God's church, he believed Jesus's "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever has faith in me shall have life, even though he dies." Regardless of your own faith tradition or the particulars of your earthly pilgrimage, we can all agree that UT, Father Jarvis, lives on. He lives on in each of us. He lives on in this Roxbury Latin School, and may it always be so. Amen.
Throughout this morning's service, some of my fellow alumni and I, all former students of Tony, will be reading selections from his book, With Love and Prayers, some of which are perhaps familiar to you. Life entitles you, my dear boys, to nothing. You have no right to actions without consequences and without guilt. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. You have no right to a happy outcome for all your efforts. If you want to be happy, you must begin with rights, but with responsibilities, with the courage to face reality, the courage to attempt great at the risk of losing, the courage to lose bravely, the courage to suffer with patience, the courage to tell the truth. If you want to be happy, you will find happiness arises not so much from getting your way and asserting your rights as it does from sacrificing your rights, sacrificing your time and treasure for the sake of others. If you want to be happy, you will find happiness not from dwelling on all that you do not have in life and feeling bitter about it. You will find happiness by dwelling on all that is good and true and beautiful in your life and being thankful for it.
Only rarely in life are we on the mountaintop with a momentary glorious vision. More frequently, we are plodding our way through the valley, sometimes even through the valley of the shadow of death. That is when faith becomes, as St. Paul says, a virtue, when we plod on, clinging to the vision we once had on the mountaintop. Faith is a virtue because it takes courage. Jesus says, "He who endures to the end shall be saved." Life is terrible disappointments. Disease and death strike randomly and unfairly. What we hope and slave for is denied us. Even worse, in a way, is what Francis Cornford called the long littleness of life. Getting up on a cold January morning, getting here, grinding up the homework, going hard in practice, getting home, sitting down to more work, finally staggering to bed. All of that requires us to hold on to the vision, to keep the faith that the effort is somehow worth it. Faith is a virtue because you have to have the guts to cling to it when you're in the valley and you lose the vision. It may cheer you to know that I have found that for particularly uncourageous people like myself, God often sends in reinforcements to help just at the right moment.
Hope is not optimism. Hope is realistic. It recognizes that life is hard, that it is unjust, that it is dangerous, that it ends for us in our death. But hope finds a reason to live, the motivation to live well in the midst of life's realities. Hope recognizes that we are weak and vulnerable and that we need help from a source beyond ourselves, from the God who has been our help in ages past and who is our hope for years to come. All of you are going to die, some sooner, some later. What will they say about you? My prayer is that they will say about you what they said about Sir Robert Shirley, that in the worst of times you did the best things, and in the most calamitous of times you hoped the best things.
It's still a good afternoon. It is more than fitting that we assembled in this hall, in this school, to remember the life of Tony Jarvis, because this school, as it stands today, is unthinkable without Tony's long and visionary service. But for a few minutes this morning, I would like to share some impressions of Tony before he came to do what became his defining life's work. Tony began his teaching life in the fall of 1968. He had just signed on as priest associate at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Cleveland. And in the course of watching some of his youth group parishioners who were playing soccer for University School, he happened to meet its headmaster. A lively exchange of banter on the sidelines resulted in an offer for Tony to teach a couple of classes at the school, which Tony thought was a fine idea. The classes he designed his first year were titled Psychology and Anthropology, notable for the fact that in his 4 undergraduate years at Harvard and 4 subsequent years of graduate and divinity studies, he had never taken a course in either psychology or anthropology. Undaunted, he took up his new responsibilities with enthusiasm. Of course, he would later admit his courses, he said, consisted of a series of his favorite books, none of which bore much on the formal disciplines of psychology or anthropology, but all of which begged the question of the meaning of life, which was then and would be forever Tony's favorite subject. The following autumn, after a suitable exchange of banter with the same headmaster, I too was hired to teach at University School, in my case, history and government. And Tony, then just very part-time, was the first colleague I got to know and like. Such was Tony's energy and enthusiasm that he was asked if he would consider full-time teaching in the school the next year. He agreed, and because he was Tony, he continued his full-time responsibilities at the church, including his direction of a phenomenally burgeoning youth program. Tony and I were members of the history department, and in the 5 years we worked together before he went off to Roxbury Latin, we alternated as chairman of that department. At the center of both of our working lives then was the development of a course for 9th graders in Western civilization. Together, we decided to abandon a single textbook approach and to compose a course instead with great primary texts, the death dialogues of Socrates, Old and New Testament Bible, Plutarch's Lives, Oedipus Rex, Einhard's Life of Charlemagne. Where we needed text to fill in chronology and thematic gaps, we wrote them ourselves. In doing this work, I realize now that both of us were doing more than putting together a school course. We were deciding on and committing ourselves to the events, the people, and the values that mattered most in what we thought was the conduct of a good life. It was nothing less than thrilling to be doing this work and to be doing it with Tony. I know we were competitive in our drive to make our respective sections of Western civilization work. We visited each other's classes. We would race to show one another examples of what we believed was the dazzling work of our accomplished students. The Western civilization course, I understand, is still largely intact in both schools. Admirable and inspiring as Tony was as a teacher, he taught me a more consequential lesson in the years we worked together in Cleveland. Like most schools, University School has an advisory system in which boys select what we called faculty sponsors or advisors, who served as confidants and mediators with other teachers and administrators if problems arose. Faculty sponsors would also write letters to parents, summarizing impressions of their sponsees' progress through the school. Most faculty made helpful relationships with the boys whom they served as sponsor, as of course did Tony. But unlike any other colleague of mine at the time, Tony extended himself to any boy in the school who seemed lost or lonely, but especially to the handful of boys who were considered to be scholastic or behavioral disasters. It was often the case that these were personally unhappy boys who were acting out in desperation. Tony sought these boys out, whether they were his own students or not. He talked to them privately. He tutored them in free periods and after school. He was at once their worst nightmare and their best friend. Their worst nightmare because he confronted them with their behavior, their defenses, their vulnerability. Their best friend because they came to know he had no reason to intrude into their lives except that he cared about them. He seemed to be certain that despite all outward evidence, they were good, promising, valuable people. And of course, when that kind of gift is given, boys change. They improve. And as Tony came to know over the course of a long career, such boys do not forget that kind of gift. Probably everyone here in this room is aware that Tony was an outsized personality. I feel that his personal excellence had more to do with his willingness to do sustained, highly detailed, ordinary work. If Tony presided over a ceremonial occasion or a meal, he took pains that the facility was in order, that every item on the menu was as it should be. Tony insisted on honoring his colleagues and guests with decorum. When he introduced speakers, he took pains to compose eloquent, factually accurate background and accomplishments. He served both his parish, All Saints Ashmont, and the school as if he were at once his master and its servant. He serves as a head of innumerable professional organizations and as trustee to many schools. But he also prepared each of his classes thoroughly. He graded papers thoughtfully and in detail. He attended and did not merely pop in on school events and games. Outside of school, he offered last rites to the dying, students, friends, and parishioners. He traveled the country presiding over their marriages and christening their children, including mine. He helped his colleagues to work hard because in Tony's company it felt terrible not to. If Tony were here listening to me, he could well be here listening to me. He would chide me at this point for dancing around the central thing in his life, the fuel firing the engine. And that is, of course, that Tony was, before anything else, a convinced Christian.
To know Tony, whatever one's faith or absence of faith, was to get an idea of what a Christian was and how he might behave in a day-to-day world. Tony conveyed this in the least domineering way imaginable, and he had a transformative effect on the most unlikely characters. University school, when we worked there together, was as secular as a private school was likely to be at the time. It was not a religious foundation to begin with, and our headmaster, though lovable in other ways, was profoundly uncomfortable with any kind of formal worship. Moreover, the school was a hearty mix of Protestants, Roman Catholics, Jews, skeptics, non-believers. Into this mix, Tony wore his clerical garb to school every day. He reintroduced prayer at shared meals. One notable Easter week, he scripted a version of Christ's Passion, which the whole assembled school took part as vocal participants. Tony cast me as Jesus. Not, I think, due to his regard for any Christ-like qualities in me, but more likely in the hopes of somehow improving me. He cast our headmaster as Pontius Pilate. As it happened, the whole school, faculty and boys alike, were energized by what was a highly liturgical exercise. Nobody complained. Tony could do that. There is not time now, nor could there ever be enough time, to tell you about Tony Jarvis as a friend, though he's the best that I will ever have. Tony and I were friends for 50 years. We were friends as teachers, we were friends as fellow headmasters, and we were friends in our professional afterwards. Whatever circumstantial or geographical distance between us, we never once lost contact. I am a writer, and Tony read and responded helpfully to every book I wrote. 2 of them are dedicated to him. With Tony, I could say anything, share anything, admit anything. He was life-saving counsel to me in the lowest ebb of my life, and apart from that pastoral dimension, he was always terrific company, full of fun, irreverent humor, and informed good talk. No one is perfect, and I'm sure God has now pardoned Tony for holding some of the worst political views in the 21st century. Tony is now atmospheric, but he is still with me every day. But how I miss him.
Good afternoon. I'm Harry Lewis of the Roxbury Latin class of 1965, and I got to know Tony Jarvis when I became a trustee in 1979. I later became the board president. Technically, that made me Tony's boss, though I don't think either one of us ever had much doubt about who was in charge of whom. He also became my true friend, exactly as Rick said, and as I know he was to many others, but besides the two of us. He offered kindness and support when they were most needed, and he offered them even when they were not asked for. Si monumentum requiris, circumspica. If you seek his monument, look around you. A school might be here had Tony Jarvis not been its headmaster for 30 years, but it would not be this school. And I'm not talking about the millions of bricks and the tons of mortar that made their way to this part of West Roxbury under Tony's leadership. I'm talking about the soul of the institution, the sense of purpose, of obligation, of mutual respect and caring, of kindness and pride, of competitive excellence, accompanied by devout selflessness. It's true. Tony really did want Roxbury Latin to be the best at everything, including humility. He wanted us to be first in humility along with everything else. I can still hear him releasing the classes at the end of an assembly in this space, the first class first, and ending with the Sixies, the scum of the earth and the lowest of the low, as he would remind them with a grin. No one I've ever known could, as Tony did, show you how much he loved you while putting you in your place at the same time. The school Tony took over was a spiritual shambles, the result of a well-intentioned but poorly aimed reform project by the previous head. Tony didn't just save Roxbury Latin, he remade it. Members of my generation would not, later in our lives, have worked for a school like the one we had attended. We worked and continue to work for Tony's RL, a school that is so fine that it makes us want to imagine that we actually went to it. Yeah, I can see there are some other alums of my generation here, yes. Tony's leadership was an inspiration. He taught us, by what he did at Roxbury Latin, how to build a better world on the shell of the world that we inherited. Tony was an institutionalist, and Roxbury Latin was never the only institution in his life. One way to paint Tony in 3 dimensions is to think of how he balanced his commitment to Roxbury Latin with his other loves and loyalties. He was an Anglophile, of course, and a learned royalist. Before Tony, we did not style ourselves the oldest school in continuous existence in North America, thus elegantly dissing our friends at Boston Latin for letting their boys out of school so that they could harass the British troops during the American War for Independence. Nor before Tony did we feel the worse for not having a coat of arms. But when we got ours, Tony did it right with a grant from the Queen. I never saw him as happy and proud as he was on that day. Some of us couldn't quite see what difference it made. But it was of a piece with Schola Illustris, Tony's meticulously researched history of the school, which was born of his important project to pin down what the words free school meant in 17th century English. He really did want the spirit of John Eliot to be closer to the daily experience of the boys in the school. Making Homer share the seal with Eliot was a way of compressing that message, the message in his book, to a simple visual. And Tony was a man of the church. Some in the early days may have worried about having an Episcopal priest at a school with Puritan roots. They had nothing to fear. Tony was the most ecumenical of school heads, with readings, prayers, and speakers of every faith, Jewish, Muslim, Christian in all its denominations, and others. He made all welcome here. We should not take that for granted. It was not always so. This was another of Tony's gifts to Roxbury Latin. And Tony managed almost always to keep his own clerical obligations out of the way of his schoolmasterly duties. I can remember only one serious conflict that he acknowledged, and how it was resolved says a lot. In one of Tony's many fundraising and community relations campaigns, there was a particular gentleman to whom Tony wanted to make a very important pitch. I don't remember this fellow's name, so I'm going to call him simply Mr. Mammon. He may even be here in the audience today. In any case, Mr. Mammon was hard to pin down, and after months of unreturned phone calls and shifting excuses, Mr. Mammon finally offered Tony a date. They could have lunch, he said, and that was a friendly and promising start to the conversation. On a Friday, in April, at noon. Good Friday. Christmas Day would have been fine. Or an early breakfast on Easter morn, but noon on Good Friday, Tony had other obligations. He did not look forward to kissing up to Mr. Mammon at that holiest of moments in the church year. He fumed to me. Yes, though Tony was nice to everyone, he could be angry, and he did allow himself to vent his anger with a few friends. I think he allowed himself to be angry in this case so he could be on the record about the conflict, not because I could relieve the distress, and certainly not so I could advise him about how to handle it. It was clear that, annoyed as he was, his mind was made up. God would just have to give him another chance. He had no reason to think that Mammon would do the same. He took the lunch date for Roxbury Latin's sake. So for Tony, Roxbury Latin was not just a family and a cause, though it was certainly those things, but almost a second church. Our gratitude for what he gave it and what he gave us can have no bound.
Last year, I witnessed a Roxbury Latin boy struggle with himself. I was inside Ruminier Hall. I just turned out the lights. The door was propped open into the loggia. I stood inside the door in the darkness under the balcony watching this little drama. Bounding along the front loggia, the boy bumped right into some visitors entering the school's front door. First, he walked by them. His first instinct, like mine in Dorchester, was to escape. I don't have time today. I'm in a rush. I have something important I have to do. I'll do the right thing next time. But this was a tough kid who wasn't able to rationalize running away from his obligation to love. And so reluctantly, he stopped and turned around and said to the visitors, "Can I help you?" "We're looking for the admissions office," they replied. He started to give them directions, then said rather sourly, "Never mind, I'll take you there." Then hearing the edge in his own voice, he added in a much sweeter tone, "I'm so, and I remember being lost when I first visited the school." And as he walked away with them, he conversed with the boy, asking him questions and making comments about the school. It was an act. He had things he wanted to do. He was not feeling generous with his time. He was feeling put upon, but he acted generous. He was busily occupied with his own life, but he acted patient. He was all wrapped up in himself, but he acted interested in them. This is what St. Paul means by love, willed concern for others when you don't feel like it.
Last week, I was returning from London on the plane. Scarcely a minute after I sat down in my assigned seat, a very attractive teenage girl claimed the seat directly in front of me. We were both in the center section, in aisle seats, and across from this girl sat her mother and younger brother in the two seats on the side. Eavesdropping over the next several hours, I discovered that this girl was a 16-year-old American enrolled at a prestigious New England boarding school. She had just spent 3 weeks in England with her family, and it was not, I gathered, her first trip. It was easy to eavesdrop. In fact, it was impossible not to eavesdrop. Everyone within 10 rows in each direction had to listen to her because everything she said was either very loud or extremely loud. At first, I was absorbed in my newspaper and only vaguely aware that she was constantly leaping out of her seat, wandering around, and then bouncing back down again. Just as I finished the paper, the stewardess brought drinks, and I sat contemplating the pleasant prospect of the cool, refreshing Coke resting temptingly on my tray table. Suddenly, however, the Coke literally bounced off the tray table and into my lap. This girl had literally jumped into her seat, the one to which my tray table was attached, and slammed the back of it, sending my Coke flying, spilling onto a fairly embarrassing spot. She had now arrested my attention, and I realized that I was just the last of many others whose attention she had by now attracted. I will not bore you with all the details about what she did and said, but a sample would include permanently parking her legs and feet in the center of the aisle, despite repeated requests from the stewardesses, so that everyone had to step over them. "But I feel so crowded. I have long legs. I need more room," said this 5'7" girl. She picked a fight with her mother for not buying her a leather jacket she wanted in London. Her mother finally said, "You've already got a leather jacket, and anyway, I let you buy several $1,000s worth of clothes for yourself in London." But the girl was obviously determined to get her mother, so she said, "This whole trip's been so boring. I've hated every minute of it." Everything she said was punctuated by repeatedly jumping up from her seat and then crashing back into it. I was carefully clutching a second, rapidly warming Coke, when suddenly onto my tray table flew one of her socks. She had decided to go barefooted and just tossed her socks into the air. All the while, she continued to contort herself into every known position, ceaselessly banging against her seat back as if trying to break it down. The elderly English couple next to me, on their first transatlantic trip, were by now enraged, and I had to keep reassuring them that this princess was not a typical American teenager. I was enraged too, but I have to admit I was even more fascinated. This girl was a virtually perfect study in self-absorption. She was utterly self-absorbed, apparently unaware of anything but her own needs and desires. It was as if the rest of us were an inanimate backdrop to her life, a stage set for her act. I'm sure there's another side to this girl, though there was not the slightest evidence of it for the 7 hours and 10 minutes the flight lasted. I'm sure that, if I should ever converse with her on some other occasion, she would reveal that she's involved at her boarding school in some politically correct activity, such as Save the Whales. But even involvement in so noble a cause would not, I think, alter the judgment of everyone who observed her on that flight, that she was basically a self-absorbed little brat imprisoned in her own life. We might expect that someone who can remain so totally focused on herself, to the exclusion of concern for anyone else, would be happy. But, of course, such self-absorption does not bring happiness. This girl was not happy. She never opened her mouth except to complain.
At the holiday concert, I had a conversation with the parents of a Roxbury Latin boy. They said, "Did you really tell our son that he'd know if he was studying hard enough for his exams if it hurt, if he was miserable?" "Yes," I said. "I wished him a week of great pain." "I think he's strong enough to push himself till it hurts." I'm pretty sure they didn't agree, but the boy was delighted when I told him his grades. Now that it's over, he said, "I'm really glad I did it." I hope he told his parents. Few boys your age in the world can postpone gratification to the degree most of you can. Few are tough enough to consider pushing themselves to the limit. You are already different. You already live by values that relatively few young men your age share. As adults, you will, I hope, live by values that relatively few adults in your generation will stand up for. In every generation, the world is saved by a few people who stand for something. In every generation, not just your generation. It is a tiny number of such people who preserve and transform society. In every generation, it is a tiny number of people who stand for something, no matter how unpopular, dangerous, or costly such a stand may be. In every generation, most people choose the easier, more comfortable way, living lives of what we called in the 60s self-fulfillment, lives without vision, lives without any great purpose, lives without costly commitments. There is another way. It is the way of the few who want to do something great with their lives, who do not fear unpopularity, who dare to risk defeat and even death standing for what they believe in. This is the better way. This is the only path to the good life. This is the way of the few who dare to care, who dare to try to make a difference. This way, I submit, is much more exciting, much more rewarding, and, dare we say it, much more fun.
Hello, everyone. I am Carolyn Pater, and Tony Jarvis was my wonderful, irreplaceable friend. I loved my friendship with him, and I grieve that his life is over. I first met Tony in 1987 when he came to Lincoln School, where I was a teacher and the head of the upper school, to interview me for the position of the director of the Winsor School. We were certainly not friends yet, and he was a tough interviewer. As he told me some years later, I was not his first choice for Winsor. But somehow he changed his mind about me, and in July 1988, I came to Winsor with much to learn about leading a school. Luckily, I think Tony felt some responsibility for me, and he kindly joined the Winsor Board of Trustees. Soon he became a guide and mentor in the work we shared and loved as school heads. In the years that followed, as I came to know Tony well and our friendship grew, I understood why he was so loved and admired at Roxbury Latin School and beyond. There was a lot to love and admire about Tony, and I'm only one among many to whom he expressed his generosity and compassion. Years ago, when I was a trustee at RL, Tony spoke about headmastering at the end of a long and arduous board meeting. I tried to scribble down every word he said, and thereafter, every September, at the opening of school, I returned to my notes from that meeting for inspiration and courage. Tony spoke about the pressure created for any head of school by the sheer number of constituencies, trustees, faculty, parents, alumni, students. He said that not everyone understands why the head doesn't do everything that he or she wants. Yet each asserts a right to the headmaster's time and expects him to listen to the anger or the worry or the hurt. He spoke of bouts of exhaustion and the inevitable isolation. He said that heads of school survive because they are idealists, seeing people and situations in terms of possibilities rather than simply as problems. He believed that being head of school is the world's best job, and he guided others to that understanding of the work. On many evenings during those years when we were at Winsor and RL, Tony and I would meet for supper. He always found time to counsel and encourage me, providing unflinching support in adversity, wisdom in untangling issues, and generous recognition of success. I asked endlessly for his advice, and he gently led me to better places by saying, "Do you think you might consider?" Or, "I imagine you thought of," and then offering me the right course that had eluded me. Tony's acts of friendship were many. He was my companion at countless Winsor RL music and drama productions, and a faithful friend on the other end of the telephone line. Around midnight on September 11th, 2001, Tony called me on the back line in my office. He said, "Carolyn, how are you? How are you managing at Winsor?" I'm not sure what I said in response, but then Tony said, "This is our Pearl Harbor." Already he had understood the huge and terrible implications of the attacks in New York, Washington, and Shanksville, while I was just trying to deal with the immediate realities of a school in turmoil. And already he had found a moment to check on a friend. I almost always welcomed Tony's advice, but I couldn't always follow it. When disagreeing with Tony, which I did occasionally, I had to make sure I was thinking clearly. He loved nothing better than a good argument. And when it came to national politics, we were usually on the opposite sides of the issues. I remember vividly dinner meetings with local heads of school when one of us would boldly engage Tony in debate on an issue, something supposedly uncomplicated, such as distributing condoms in schools, or awarding athletic scholarships at ISL schools. Headmasters rush in where angels fear to tread. Tony was a courageous man of enduring principles, and his leadership was characterized by his willingness to speak his mind. The modern Roxbury Latin School was surely shaped by his deeply held ideas. He was also somewhat given to hyperbole and had a distinctive way of expressing strongly held views. Years ago, I began making a list of Tony's unequivocal statements, each of which I heard many times. So here are a few. Upon completing the Robert Smith Theater, "This is absolutely the last building I will ever put up." At the end of October, end of every October, "I'm just hanging on by my fingernails." Twice a year, "I've just had the worst parent conference of my life. I mean, absolutely the worst." This was always directed at me at least twice a year. "Only a wimp would close school for that little dusting of snow." Usually in May, I've just hired a teacher who walks on water. Just before graduation each year, I literally haven't slept in days. At graduation each year, "This is the strongest class in the school's history." And just when I needed it most, Tony would say, "Don't forget how much I love you." Last spring, Tony delivered a beautiful tribute to Virginia Wing, Windsor's 5th director, as we celebrated her life. I did not expect that just 1 year later, far too soon, we would gather to celebrate Tony's life. Last July, Tony wrote me a brief email saying, "Any chance you could meet me for lunch tomorrow or Friday?" Since I was at that time recovering from an injury, I hoped we could wait a few weeks. And then he wrote me the following, my last message from Tony. "Dearest Carolyn, the reason I wanted to break bread with you was to share with you, as I promised to do when the time came, that I have ended chemo, doing me no good and making me very sick, and that I have 9 to 18 months to live. I am very happy about this. I hated the idea of old age and the inability to be doing things for people day by day. God has arranged things beautifully, and I shall not face a useless old age lingering about. I am very happy about things. How could I not be after the happiest possible life? I've rarely felt so happily resolved as I do at this point. A nearly perfect ending to a perfect life. Much love as ever, Tony." I never did get that last chance to break bread with Tony, as the end came so soon after he wrote that message. But I am filled with gratitude that I knew him well, that he was a loving and loyal friend, and that he gave me and all of us such a powerful example of how to live with purpose, integrity, and courage. His life and his death perfectly express the wisdom of a poem by Mary Oliver. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. Thank you, Tony, for showing us the way.
Thank you for your kind invitation this afternoon, Mr. Brennan. My name is Win Bassett, or Winsky, to Father Jarvis, and I was a student of his at Berkeley Divinity School at Yale. I'm a teacher and coach at Montgomery Bell Academy, a boys' school in Nashville, Tennessee. When I discovered Father Jarvis's With Love and Prayers, which contributed to my leaving the field of law to train under this giant, to become a schoolmaster like him, I never could have imagined that I would be asked one day to say a few kind words about my teacher, mentor, and friend. I will call him Father Jarvis this afternoon because I always did. 2 years ago, someone in the school world told me that if I wanted to be taken seriously as Tony's peer, I should refer to him as Tony. I never was nor ever will be his peer. And when I told Father Jarvis what this person advised, he said in his most loving way something I cannot repeat to you this afternoon. Mr. Brennan asked if I would speak about Father Jarvis's time at Berkeley Divinity School, the Episcopal seminary at Yale. After 30 years at Roxbury Latin, Father Jarvis served as chaplain at Eton College and as scholar in residence in schools in Australia before becoming the founding director in 2008 of the Educational Leadership and Ministry Program at Berkeley. The Episcopal Seminary sought Father Jarvis's experience and wisdom in preparing Divinity School students at Yale to be leaders in independent schools, colleges, and churches as teachers, coaches, chaplains, administrators, and priests. For the next 8 years, he traveled by his beloved train to and from Boston and New Haven almost every week during the school year. On Sunday afternoon, after the service at All Saints Ashmont, Father Jarvis sat with the weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal for 3 hours, and he never forgot his package of Thomas's English muffins for his breakfast each morning in Connecticut. After his arrival in New Haven, he walked the 1.5 miles to his small apartment on the hill of Yale's Divinity School. On each Thursday afternoon, he repeated the journey in reverse, sometimes bringing green seminarians back with him to practice their preaching at All Saints the following Sunday. For those 8 years, and even after his retirement and the conferring of an honorary degree from Berkeley in 2016, Father Jarvis knew and loved his seminary students, who now number among the heads, assistant heads, chaplains, teachers, coaches, and priests at some of this country's finest independent schools, colleges, and churches. For the occasion of Berkeley's conferring his honorary degree, I assembled letters from his former students, almost all of whom became his dear friends, to be presented to him at the convocation. I know they would not mind my offering some of their words to you today. One history teacher wrote, "It brought me great joy to mimic your mannerisms, copy your unique turns of phrase, and work on my best Tony accent. I realized that I imitated you because you were a giant. You have a giant presence, a way of gently commanding attention in the classroom that pulled me and others in. You have a giant mind, one that rejects easy answers and formulations, and always pushed us to points where we would struggle and sometimes stumble, only to get up with better thoughts, ideas, and appreciation for the toughness of teaching. You have a giant heart. You loved us always, showing us not only in your teaching, but in your pastoral care, your meals generally shared with us, your time and your frequent encouragement. They say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. I may have dropped trying to nail your accent and posture, but as a teacher, one thing I will never stop doing is trying to imitate you." One priest wrote, "When I have lacked direction in the midst of my nascent pastoring, I have often asked myself, what would Tony Jarvis do? This strategy has had varying degrees of effectiveness, but nevertheless has allowed me to ground myself in a greater wisdom than I could muster on my own." And one assistant head and priest penned a hymn, later sang at Father Jarvis's memorial service in Yale Divinity School's chapel. It ends, "With love and prayers the saints commend a life of charity, the poor to serve, the sick to tend, and sinful souls like ours to mend. May we such servants be." Father Jarvis was a lot of things to a lot of people, but I think the hymn writer got it right. He was, over all else, a servant. From those to whom much has been given, much will be expected. You all heard him say over and over again. Like many of his best stories, we pretended tired us, but never did. He was one of the few people whom I've known to stake his life on being Christ's servant and mean it. After I left Father Jarvis and Berkeley Divinity School for the boys' school I now serve, he sent with glorious frequency books from his personal library for my education and pleasure. Outside of his own company, mentorship, and friendship, these remain some of my greatest treasures. And one of my supreme joys is to discover his rare marginalia, or dog-eared page, upon opening a book that once graced his palms. In honor of the Feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the year of our Lord 2016, his exact inscription, he mailed me Stephen Spender's autobiography, World Within World. Upon opening Spender's history, I found 2 page corners folded. The latter marked page occurs halfway through the book and signals Spender's first meeting with T.S. Eliot, another Jarvis favorite. The other cornered page occurs in John Bailey's introduction to the book, in which he recounts Spender's writing about his music teacher in boarding school at age 9. Spender writes, "He had a manner perhaps more brusque than that of other masters, but less frightening. It had more of the warm, great world than of the refrigerated school. While he conducted our singing, I used to stare at his domed, bald head with the clusters of hair on each side and at the back, and pray that when I grew up, I would be bald." For the child unquestioningly attributes beauty to whom he loves. I pray that when I grow up, that I'll be half the Christ servant, schoolmaster, mentor, man of letters, and human that Father Jarvis was. For this boy unquestioningly attributes beauty to whom he loves. Thank you.
Every failure, every defeat, every bit of suffering that we experience makes us stronger. Stronger, among other reasons, because we become more aware of the sufferings of others. Our sufferings, our failures, our defeats can become for us professors of love. They make us sensitive to the burdens and sorrows that others must bear. My beloved children, now and in the years ahead, you will suffer and fail and know despair. My prayer for you is that when you experience such suffering, you will dig deep. The spiritual muscle you will need to cope with life's many difficulties. And that, in your own suffering, you will grow to understand with compassion the suffering of others.
Every one of us is on a journey. We each have one and only one life. And in the perspective of all things, our own life is remarkably short. We are not gods who are invulnerable and immortal. In our fleeting and temporary existences, as we realize that all our trophies are so much tinsel and frippery, we instinctively reach out for what is lasting and permanent. The psalmist of Israel sings, "As the deer pants for the pool of clear water to quench his thirst, so longs my soul, God, for you." Or as the old Bible sublimely puts it, "Like as a hart desireth the water brook, so longeth my soul after thee, O God." St. Augustine expresses this same restless yearning. You, God, have created us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their peace in you. The beginning of wisdom is the realization that if you want to stand on your own 2 feet, you must learn to kneel on your own 2 knees. To be strong and tough, you must acknowledge your humanity, your temporariness, and your weakness, and have the courage to ask for help from your fellow human beings who are on the same journey as you, and from God, who alone endures and who alone can give you ultimate peace. If you are honest with yourself as you feel your way along this human journey, you will experience times when you lose the vision, times of discouragement, times of loneliness, times when you feel powerless or lost, times of suffering and despair and emptiness. In these darkest moments, you are never, ever separated from the love of God, no matter how insignificant or worthless you may feel. You need not wait until the darkest hour to place your hand in the hand of God. The truly strong man, the man who can stand on his own 2 feet, is the one who realizes his own weakness, his own limits. The truly strong man knows that he needs to ask help from his companions on life's journey and from God.
I used to be quite despondent about the human race, quite cynical about human nature, and God knows there's a great deal to be despondent and cynical about. As I have experienced more of life, however, I have come to think that there are a lot of good people in the world, people who have broken out of themselves, people who risk loving others. Not enough such people, but a lot. I dare to hope and pray that each of you will be such a person, that you will have the courage to burst out of the prison of self and to involve yourselves with grace and charm and humor in the lives of others. I hope, in short, that people will say of you when you're gone, here was a man of courage who made a difference.
I guess this makes me the closer, or the last man standing between you and a bathroom break. I'm humbled to be standing on this podium today at this very lectern where Tony himself delivered so many memorable addresses, imparted so much wisdom over so many years. This is truly an honor. Many of you knew Kay Hubbard, Tony's longtime aide-de-camp, herself a force of nature. She and Tony were devoted to each other, but they bickered frequently. One day, after a typical spat, Kay came storming into my office, obviously exasperated. How can such a flawed man be such a brilliant headmaster? Let's start with his vision for this school, razor sharp, laser focused. Tony understood that unless we had a consensus view of who we are, we would never become what we wanted to be, what we claimed to be. He made it his mission, took it as his mandate to articulate that vision and to build that consensus. And he relished the task. He had an iron will, of course, and an unshakable sense of right and wrong, which often meant that he was right and you were wrong. Tony was an unapologetic monarchist. The coat of arms, King Charles I, annual messages from the Queen, all affirmed for him the divine right of headmasters and the legitimacy of a headmaster who sat on a throne. Once, about this time of year, just after the senior class had voted on their valedictorian, Tony called me out sharply to say that they had elected the wrong boy. How could you let that happen? Democracy, I said. On the other hand, although he must have been apprehensive, he did not preview the boy's valedictory address. And by the way, while it was well understood that Tony believed in freedom of schoolboy speech in only the narrowest of terms, he never once asked to see an article for the tripod before its publication. In the daily life of the school, Tony's word was law, his reality became reality, and just his saying so made it so. I once had the temerity to challenge the provenance of something he regularly attributed to John Eliot. Undaunted, he responded, well, if he didn't say it, he would have. Tony was a tough taskmaster for sure, and he kept a watchful eye on everything. Some of you remember that morning after a heavy rain, on a day just like today, when he sent the maintenance crew out into the lingering mist to dry the entire senior grass with white athletic towels on hands and knees so that the cum laude reception could be held on the lawn as usual. There were boys who took the long way around the school in order to avoid walking past his office, even going outside through the snow, lest they be caught with a shirt tail untucked. Or some who wished that they were still too young to shave so that they wouldn't get his infamous backhanded compliment for their lazy grooming. I was in Tony's office for more than one parent conference over the years, as were many of my colleagues, when our only role was to provide silent support, like members of a Greek chorus, as Joe Kerner observed, nodding our heads and not saying anything. Tony orchestrated those meetings with precision, and going in, he always knew what he wanted coming out. There was a particularly challenging back and forth with a couple of unreasonable parents who recklessly wheeled out one lame excuse after another to justify their son's bad behavior. The boy really was a terror. Tony never lost his cool as tensions rose, and of course he carried the day. After some uncomfortable back and forth, the tide turned decisively when he proclaimed matter-of-factly, "We love your son, but we don't like him. That was vintage Jarvis shock and awe. But it was okay, because it turned out that they didn't like him either. So after a period of parental reconstruction, Tony concluded the meeting with characteristically pastoral send-off, as if they were leaving confession, repentant and absolved. "Now go in peace," he said as they got up to leave, "and tell your son you love him. Today, he needs to hear you say the words." Tony believed in delivering the goods, as he put it, succinctly and without elaboration. Whenever I hear one of my colleagues avow that he had a long talk with Johnny or Billy or Harry or Frankie, I want to reply, channeling my best Jarvis, "No, you should have had a short talk with him. Don't insult him by repeating yourself. He got it the first time around." We have bright boys here. Needless to say, many are verbal acrobats. One boy, one of the brightest kids I've ever taught, delighted in rattling his teachers by out-talking and even outwitting them. Tony, of course, who backed his faculty to the hilt, would tolerate no such disrespect. "Come and see me, David," he said in a foreboding monotone, his index finger extended pointedly. Hodie, that's Latin for today. The meeting that followed was intentionally brief. "We've done enough talking," he said tersely. "Now it's time for you to change." And the boy did change dramatically, and eventually proved himself to be one of our best kids, and ultimately one of Tony's biggest fans. Certain students could not escape the headmaster's scrutiny, even when they tried to hide in the crevices like cockroaches. And they were usually better off for his attention, although they didn't always think so at the time. I asked one alumnus recently, a decidedly rambunctious lad during his RL years, why he thought he had become one of Tony's projects. "Mr. Jarvis was drawn to a certain amount of dysfunction," he said. There were hodiers with any number of miscreants over the years, and they were no boy's idea of a good time. The advice of one senior to a classmate who was about to be called on the carpet was given only half in jest. "Cry as quickly as possible." Cry as quickly as possible. It goes a lot easier. But this is not to say that every boy was brought to tears in Tony's office. Many more would stop in looking for advice or seeking his comfort and support, or even just to chat. Remarkably, his door was almost always open, and I don't recall hearing of anyone being turned away because Tony was too busy for an unscheduled drop-in. But he kept those meetings short and to the point, and he was a master at easing overly glib talkers out the door on skates. "Teenage boys are not good at exit lines," he said. Tony had a gift for articulating simple truths in the most succinct and compelling ways, some original, some borrowed from other sources, all now ingrained in the school vernacular. We care most of all what kind of person a boy is. A Roxbury Latin boy must have the courage to face derision in standing for what is highest and is expected in all dealings. You know them all by heart. He emblazoned them throughout the school, where they would be seen daily and osmotically absorbed. In the Bernstein tea room, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. And above the stairway leading to the athletic fields, in ancient Greek, the prize is worthy and our hope is great. In the refectory, perhaps the most memorable, to those to whom much has been given, much will be expected. And of course, there's the inscription behind me. Eliot told Tony it was his favorite psalm. Roxbury Latin under Tony Jarvis was never a relaxing place, but the school jangled with positive energy, much of it emanating from Tony himself, and it kept us on our toes. He set a high bar and a school-wide drive to achieve excellence that continues to this day. He never made things easy, but he invariably made them better by prodding and challenging us to be more than we would have been otherwise. Tony aspired to sustain the golden age of athletics even during the inevitable slumps. No pressure, boys. I once overheard him bucking up a disheartened football player who was facing our arch-rival Nobles in a make-or-break grudge match that coming weekend. The team had been mired in a 3-game losing streak. "Just go out there and do the best you can," he said. "Football is about more than winning and losing," he reassured the boy. "But remember," he added after a beat, "it's better to win than to lose." Tony loved those boys, and he understood them, what they needed, what they wanted, what brought them joy, and what caused them pain, what made them tick. He forged a natural bond with them, I think, because in the grown-up Tony, there were the remains of an impulsive adolescent, and a petulant nipper at that. He struggled to tame that unruly child his whole life. Tony could reach into the minds and hearts of RL boys because he could relate to them, connect to their best and even to their worst selves. He enjoyed them, untangled them, consoled them, but never indulged them. 2 years ago, Kerry graciously invited Tony to speak to the school about whatever was in his heart, just as Tony himself had instructed so many hall speakers over the years. Of course, he commanded the room. He was in top form, and he delivered a profoundly moving address. But I was certain I had heard his voice quiver as he was finishing his remarks. It was the only time that I had seen him lose his composure at the lectern. "Were you feeling nostalgic?" I asked him afterwards. "No," he said quietly. "I was looking out and seeing all those beautiful faces." I loved Tony, and he loved me as he loved all of us, as a father loves his children, as a pastor loves his flock. This full house is a testament to how many lives he touched and the love and respect that we have for him in return. He could be demanding and difficult at times, but I am forever grateful to him for all that he did for me. Grateful for pushing me harder than I wanted to be pushed. Grateful for inspiring me to be my best self, for challenging me to love these kids and to give them everything I've got, and for empowering me to make a difference here. Most of all, I am indebted to Tony for telling me what I needed to hear, not what I wanted to hear. And while that was difficult at times, I am forever grateful to him for paying me that compliment. I was reading an obituary recently. It's a hobby of mine, and I had come across the eulogy of a decidedly undistinguished elderly man written in 1895 in typically florid Victorian prose. It read in part, "Phineas and I were fast friends. As I looked upon his calm and noble brow so still in death, my thoughts ran across the electric wires of memory, calling up and back the many joyous hours we had spent together. He no doubt felt, as most of us feel as we survey our past, that life has been a failure, that all has come to nothing. We make our plans in our wild, exuberant youth to do too much, and later we regret that we have done too little." Nothing of the sort could be said of Tony Jarvis. He lived his life at full bore, unable or unwilling to throttle back, determined to accomplish everything he had ever set out to do, and never allowing himself to come up short. In the last few years, he was in a greater hurry than ever. Over the years, he had invariably signed his letters, "Much love, Tony." But once he had been diagnosed with cancer, that closing became, "Much love, Tony," hastily. And in the final months, as time began to run out on him, that was shortened to MLTH. I last saw Tony the week before he died, and although he was in pain and greatly distressed to be losing control, as you know, Tony always had to be in control, he reassured me that he was not afraid to die. "I've had a wonderful life," he said. "My bags are packed." As a man of faith, he was surely ready to book passage on his next journey, but I speak for all of us when I say that we were not ready to let him go. And now I will be so presumptuous as to close my remarks in the Jarvis tradition, as he did every time he addressed the school. Will you please be upstanding? I brought you to your feet because Tony deserves a standing ovation, a form of approbation that he would surely forbid were he to have his way now. But this one time, he will not have his way. And so, Tony, we thank you. We will remember you always with love and prayers.
Would you please join me in standing for the benediction? May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. And would all the people of goodwill join me in saying amen? Amen. Thank you.